Who do you trust? During times of calm and times of crisis, who do you trust? I'm Minister Cheryl Turner from Trinity Baptist Church in Arlington, and that is the focus of my message today. It's not meant as an accusatory question, but an invitation to pause and reflect, to consider and self-examine that in the circumstances that each one of us experiences, who do I trust? Who do you trust? Who do we trust? And there are a lot of competing voices, and they're vying for our attention. Who do we listen to? Who is the authority? Who we listen to reflects who we trust, doesn't it? There's challenges regarding the reliability of our information sources. We read things on Facebook and we hear things on TV, and one channel is reporting it in one way and another is reporting it with a different angle. What are their agendas? Do they match with our agenda? Who do you trust? And then comes the issue of rights and responsibilities. What are my rights, and do I exert them at this time? What are my responsibilities? The way we respond reflects who we trust. You know, these challenges that we're going to read about in today's scripture from Acts chapter 27 are just as relevant to the challenges that we're facing today. And the question continues to be, who do I trust? Who do you trust? I invite you to join me on one of the legs of Paul's journey as a prisoner heading to Rome as we consider that question. Paul had been arrested and had been charged, and he decided to exert his rights as a Roman citizen, that he should have a hearing in Rome. And so he was being transported by a Roman centurion and a group of soldiers under the centurion's authority. And they were going to be transported by ship. The question becomes, who's in charge? Who do they listen to? Who do they trust? Now, for those who may not know it, or as a reminder for those of us who do, Paul is a man who had been known as Saul. He identified himself as a Jew among Jews. He had studied the Hebrew scriptures, and he was an authority. He had studied under a man of authority, and he was an authority. And he felt that those following the way of Jesus Christ, were heretics. And he was seeking to root them out, to stop the spread of this dangerous contagion. And so he went after them. He took the authority, and he was pursuing them. But along the way, he had a road to Damascus experience. He had an encounter with Jesus Christ, who had already died and been resurrected. And in that encounter, he heard, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Paul had to make a decision, or Saul had to make a decision, about who he was going to trust. Was he going to trust what he knew from before, the traditions, the teachings, his own authority? Or was he going to put his trust in Jesus Christ? Well, Saul, who later became known as Paul, experienced a transformation of his heart and his mind, his thoughts, and his attitude. And he went from being prosecutor and persecutor to emissary and ambassador and advocate. Someone who took what they had received and where he had placed his trust and his hope to sharing that with others. I invite you to listen to Acts 27, beginning at verse 9. And for context, I know it's a long passage, but I'm going to read to the end so you have the end of the story. But I invite you to be thinking about, as you hear the words, and maybe as you read them yourself, who is being trusted in this scenario? And what are the circumstances? What are the parallels between our lives today in the midst of coronavirus and on this ship that Paul and others are on as a prisoner in the midst of a storm that's threatening their lives? Much time had been lost, and sailing had already been dangerous, because by now it was after the fast. So being after the fast, that means that it was after the Day of Atonement, which places this story in the midst of October. In terms of traveling at sea for ships, September was a questionable time. It was iffy. In terms of weather conditions, winds, etc. October was even more dangerous, more treacherous, because there was the challenge of storms coming up, such as we're going to hear about. And then November was pretty much a no-go. It was impossible or next to impossible. So here they are on the ship. Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to Paul, said, "Follow the advice of the pilot, of the owner of the ship." Who do we trust? Paul was declaring this is dangerous. The centurion is in authority over Paul. Paul is his prisoner. And they defer to the pilot and to the owner. And what is the agenda of the pilot and the owner? Well, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. So they're in a place where it's not safe, really. It's not the best harbor for them to be able to be in. It's a small fishing village, and the challenge is that it's not a place that would necessarily be safe for the ship, and it's not a place that outsiders want to be in. And so, for economic factors, for perceived safety reasons, for convenience, the decision is made that they're going to go forward. They'll sail forth. Who do you trust? When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the Northeaster swept down the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. The understanding is that Acts was written by Luke. And Luke was a physician, and in that it's understood that Luke was probably with Paul. He was among the passengers that were accompanying them on this trip. And I continue. When the men had hoisted it aboard, whoops, sorry about that. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the lifeboat would have normally been tied to the back of the boat, and it would have and it would have been strung along. But this storm that's hit them is such that they are trying to secure it. They're bringing it up onto the deck. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. So they're so concerned that the ship is going to come apart in these winds and waves that they have trying to secure to hold it together with the ropes. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. So that precious cargo, that economic motivation to continue on to get it to where they were going to receive the financial reward, is now deemed to be unnecessary. It needs to be thrown overboard to lighten the ship so that they don't sink. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continuing raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So here they are now. They're in this storm, and they've lost hope. Have you lost hope? Have you given up? Have you been assessing what your priorities are and throwing certain things overboard because maybe they don't hold as much of a significance in this storm that we're experiencing right now? After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." So Paul is saying, reminding them, hey, I told you not to do this, but have courage. Last night, an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." Who do you trust? Who is Paul trusting? Paul is trusting the messenger from God that is saying, don't be afraid, Paul. Now, notice the messenger from God didn't say, okay, I'm going to stop the storm and you're going to get safely to the other side. I'm going to give you this victory that it's going to be dry and calm and peaceful. No, he's actually saying the boat's going to be destroyed, but the lives are going to be saved. Perhaps there's a boat that you're in right now. We're all experiencing storms, one same storm of coronavirus. But as I read in a meme on Facebook, we're all in different boats. So maybe you're in a place that your boat feels like it's sinking. Who do you trust? On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. They're clearly getting closer to the shore. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the daylight. Now, see, they didn't have a means of navigating except by the stars, and they're in darkness, and the wind is howling, the waves are threatening, and all they can do right now is pray for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Who do you trust? The sailors are looking out for themselves. They're attempting to escape. They don't care about who's left behind. They're going for their own rights. Their attempt to save themselves, no matter what else happens to others. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. So Paul had this message, and he was trusting that God was going to save him, but he didn't sit back and say, okay, whatever will be, God said I'm going to say. He's actively participating. He's engaged. He's partnering with God. He's using the wisdom that he has from God, and he's proceeding accordingly. What about us? Who do we trust? Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. What a witness that is. He didn't just tell them with words, but he set an example. And he didn't just eat, but he gave thanks to God for it. And then he ate. What about us? In the midst of our trials and our challenges and the isolation or needing to go to work on the front lines, whether we're in supermarkets or hospitals or nursing homes, or maybe we're unemployed. What is our witness for those of us who say we trust in Jesus Christ? What do our words and our actions, how do they match up to what we post on social media? For the way we treat others when they might encroach on the 6-foot distance in the supermarket, or they're going up the wrong aisle, one-way aisle in the wrong direction. What example do we set? Who do we trust? They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. So Paul's example encouraged them. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Again, they're trying to lighten the load, and grain, when it gets wet, swells, which would have caused even more potential damage to the ship and to their lives. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. What are you holding on to? What is it that is holding you back? That you can see ahead, but you're not quite yet willing to let go of. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. Who do you trust? The soldiers' lives depended on whether or not those prisoners got to where they needed to be. If prisoners escaped, they were responsible and would pay for with their own lives. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. The centurion saw something in Paul. He didn't want Paul to be among prisoners that were killed. And so the centurion interceded on Paul's behalf. The centurion ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Everyone reached land safely, just as the messenger had told Paul. They still had to swim for it. They didn't have a divine helicopter that appeared on the scene and moved them from point A to point B. Who do you trust? It's interesting that we also see here humility versus arrogance. Now the pilot and the owner are still on board the ship, and so they are authorities responsible. The centurion, had the power to take charge, and did. But rather than respond in arrogance, they all responded in humility. They saw something different. They had grasped onto the hope that maybe there was an opportunity for survival. For those of us who have that hope in Jesus Christ, as Paul did, we have the opportunity to offer the meager bread that we hold to another, to hold out our hands and our hearts in hope. Who do you trust? The question remains, how do we respond during times of calm and during times of crisis? What we truly believe is reflected in our choices, in our behavior. Are we just sharing words? Are we rehearsing the things that we've memorized and that we've heard? Or do we truly believe and act accordingly? Paul made a 180-degree turn when he came to accept and receive and believe in Jesus Christ. Psalm 34 speaks about tasting and seeing that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Verse 11 says, "Come, my children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it." Verse 18, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." We can't do it in our own strength, but in the power of the Holy Spirit that we receive when we believe in Jesus Christ, we can keep our lips from lying. We can choose not to follow the evil ways that we're tempted into. We can be Christ's emissaries. We can be God's children. Who do you trust? My prayer for you is that the God of hope will fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, that you may be filled with the power, with the Holy Spirit, that you may accomplish what God has for you. Keep running the race and keep considering, who do I trust? God bless you.